Hey everybody, Eric here for the Unlockables podcast, and before we begin the episode, I just want to give a special shout out to all the people who support the show on Patreon. These incredible people are Chris from 1 Hour 1 Decision, Stephen Pay, Dave Jackson, Chris Coplien, Rick Firestone, Colby Moyer, Keith Gasper, Nikolai at Night, Mask Keaton, and Mike Mesa. Thank you guys so much for your continued support of the Unlockables podcast. Now, let's get on with today's episode. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another exciting episode of the Unlockables podcast, the story of video games, the people who play them, and the memories made along the way. As always, I am your host, Eric. I'd like to thank you so much for tuning in. Wherever, whenever, in time and space you might be located, it means so much to me that you're willing to check out the show and see what's going on in the world of video games. Now, we're going to skip all the niceties because I've got a really awesome conversation set up for today. If you saw the title of the episode, you guessed that right. We're going to be talking about everyone's favorite Final Fantasy series, Final Fantasy? Oh, that was kind of a weird tongue twister. I don't know. Who knows what the fuck is going on? But just allow me to introduce the two people that I invited on the show to have this incredible conversation. And first of all, from the far, far away land of the Retro Hangover podcast, it is the legendary summoner of the Dick Dragon himself. It is my good friend, Chris Coplien. Chris, how you doing tonight, sir?
I am here for some Dick Dragon fantasy adventures.
We got some. You went to space there. Oh, wow. Summoning the Dick Dragon. Is that summon sequence longer than Knights of the Round is the question.
No, that's why Shane didn't show up. I didn't want to do it too long because he might
just
pop in.
Appear in the call.
It would get confusing. Yeah.
So if you do that in any other place other than in the episode, does his nose start to bleed and he's like, I'm being summoned?
I'm assuming so. I have to assume so at this point. He hasn't confirmed that yet, but I've gone over to his house and there are a lot of tissues stuck in the corner. I'm assuming that's for bloody noses.
Absolutely fantastic.
If the Dick Dragon was a summon in a Final Fantasy, which Final Fantasy would it be used in?
Oh, that's a good question. Definitely Final Fantasy X too, because that game is horny as fuck.
That definitely tracks. Speaking of horny as fuck, I don't know how this transition is going to work, but my other
are my nipples hard?
Speaking of nosebleeds as well, I don't know what's going on here anymore, but my other guest here is the brooding, spiky-haired protagonist of the Main Quest podcast. It is my good friend, Keith. Keith, how you doing tonight, sir?
I'm doing good. I have performed my civil duty of paying my taxes. It is tax day.
Hooray.
Yeah. And I'm doing good. Thanks for having me here.
No problem. What a better way to reward your civic duty than talking about a weird Japanese series? Seems appropriate.
I do kind of have spiky hair now that you mentioned it.
You look like that dude from Final Fantasy 15.
Which
one always takes pictures.
Is that Prompto?
Yeah, Prompto.
Yes,
that's
that
it.
guy. I was gonna say he looks more like Ignis. I mean, he's got the glasses down. Keith, how good is your cooking skills?
Yeah, that works too.
Decent.
Okay, we'll take it. Decent. So if we're ever on a road trip to save the world together, I guess you're the cooking guy. So congratulations.
All right, I'll take it.
All right. So if you can't tell by the name of the title, we are here to discuss the Final Fantasy series as a whole. Depending on when you're listening to this, as of the time that this episode will come out, unless I completely change my mind, Final Fantasy 16 is right around the corner. It should be out any time now, I believe, sometime in June. And there's been a lot of hullabaloo on the interwebs about this game specifically coming out. It's taking a much more action-oriented approach. leading a lot of people to complain and be like, this is not my Final Fantasy. This is not Final Fantasy at all. And before we get into all that, that is going to be the context of the conversation that we are going to have tonight. We're going to try and dig down and maybe once and for all offer a definitive answer as to what the hell is Final Fantasy. But before we do that, I just want to check in. As you must know, we must do the customary podcast gamer greeting. And I must ask you both, what have you guys been playing as of late?
Absolutely nothing.
Woo!
I'm really trying to think here. What have I been playing?
That sounds incredible, actually, if I'm being 100% honest.
Nothing really. Just, getting my butt
grass.
handed to me by a 5-year-old in Smash Brothers periodically.
There you go.
But other than that, not a whole lot, actually. Sorry to let you down. It's hard to imagine a video game podcaster not playing a video game, but it's true.
You've been playing a lot of Sega Genesis games, so I don't blame you. And I've been seeing the games you've been playing too on top of it. So
Yeah.
I mean, the last couple episodes that have come out, you've actually seemed to like the games. So, I mean, that must be kind of refreshing.
Well, depending on when this comes out, that's very true. Yeah. The Player versus Podcast, the listener request month thing, it's at the whim of the listener. So half the games they select for me, I have never even heard of. So it's always like a huge surprise for me when it actually ends up, I actually end up really enjoying the game for what it is. And even if I don't enjoy it, by the time this comes out, I'm sure the month will be over with, but, I didn't like Einhander just because I'm not very good at shmups.
they're tough.
Yeah, I suck. I suck at them. But I could absolutely see people liking it, but I could also at the same time see people who are into more traditional shmups not liking it either. So I feel like it's kind of like a mixed bag when it comes to that, when you're kind of trying to look at it objectively, but on the whole, I never really saw anything wrong with it. It was just more of came down to personal taste, to be honest.
You'd think that with some of those listener requests that, the general arc of the internet seems to bend towards chaos. And it is surprising that some people pick some legitimately good things that actually I was surprised to hear. If it was me, I just bet people would pick things, like a Bubsy 3D or something just to screw with me. But the fact that you got some interesting and some good variety in there is pretty cool.
Yeah, 2022 was that chaotic year. There was a lot of meme picks for that that got chosen. There was one, so I usually try to pick 3 games, right? And I picked my 3 for this past year, and I'm I know somewhere in this hopper there is somebody put in Shadow the Hedgehog, and I really wanted to experience Shadow the Hedgehog. I've never played it. I know it's
Bad.
Yes, that's not the word I was looking for.
But maybe bad in the best way. Yeah, the reputation.
I know it's reputation.
It's so bad.
And just I guess I wanted to get some framework for that compared to a Sonic game. Even technically it is a Sonic game. I don't know. I really wanted to play that. So yeah, I ended up picking a 4th game for this past year and still didn't pull out Shadow the Hedgehog. So I don't know who entered that. I don't even know if they're listening to this, but hey, try again next year.
Eventually, odds are that we will pull it one day. So we'll definitely look forward to that one. Let's go to the other side of the room. Chris, my man, what have you been playing lately?
Well, because I'm insane, I've been trying to play all of the Final Fantasy and Ys games.
Perfect.
They don't even relate to each other, but I can make a cool name and call it, or stupid name, Final Fantasy Ys, except with the Y on the end of the Final Fantasy. But yeah,
absolutely brilliant.
That's cute.
I know, right? I put a lot of thought into it. But I just finished up at the time of this recording Ys 8, and that game is fucking incredible. It's not like extremely profound. It's not a life-changing game on the level of Shadow of the Colossus or anything like that. It's just a really fun game. It's It's giving me a lot of the same vibes as Ys Origin, except I think better. I think it's a better game, and that was my game of the year for 2022. So it's boding well for that, if that means anything from me giving awards or whatever. But there it is. It might be. It's easily in the lead. I had so much fun with it, and I've also been playing Final Fantasy X, and I am absolutely still in love with this game. I think I am loving this game more than what I did when I originally played it. It's perfect. I don't know why I'm like just raving about it. I probably shouldn't. Like, I should be trying to look at it objectively, but I can't, because I feel like I'm back in the year 2001 again, and I feel like a kid, and it's just giving me all these warm, fuzzy feelings of what life was like when I was still a naive child, and it's making me happy. And there's not many gaming experiences that can really replace that. So just diving into Final Fantasy X, soaking in that atmosphere, soaking in the plot, and just that beginning part. I know I'm a big softie when it comes to video games, like a huge major softie. So like knowing what happens later in the game and seeing a lot of those discussions they have in the beginning of it, like when you're like leaving Besaid for the first time, and Yuna's waving goodbye and she's so emotional. Like the first time you play that game, you're like, why? This isn't a big deal. It's just like you're normally going on a quest. But knowing what the overarching plot is like, oh my God, like this is a really well crafted scene. And I don't know. It's really taking me back, and I'm loving every moment of it. And I guess it's the perfect game to be playing in preparation for an episode like this.
Yeah, no, it really is. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm just let everybody know that by the end of this episode, we're all going to hate each other.
Probably.
Oh, yes. Anyways, yeah, just to touch on what I've been doing very quickly. I've been on the other side of the Square Enix offices from you, Chris. I've been diving into, of course, the Kingdom Hearts series, and I'm wrapping up Kingdom Hearts 2. I made the insane decision to try and platinum that game to get all the achievements, and I'm kind of like regretting my decision 40 hours in. So, but I figured if I'm doing an entire miniseries on the Kingdom Hearts series, and I constantly profess to my show that KH2 is my favorite game of all time, I should at least give it the old college try of mastering it completely. I've still got a couple of really hard challenges and an entire critical mode playthrough to go. So that is going to be probably awful. And by the time I'm done, this might not be my favorite game anymore. I might be that mad, but we'll have to see. So I'm doing that. And the only other thing I've been playing lately is we are, at the time of recording, like 3 days away from the release of the Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp. And I've just been playing the shit out of the GBA version of Advance Wars 2 emulated on my computer. Nintendo, please don't arrest me. And just getting back in the groove for that and just loving that game so much. Oh, it's such a good GBA game. And I'm so glad that Nintendo finally decided to put this game out after all of the stuff that happened with Ukraine and Russia. I'm very excited. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And you'll probably hear me talking about that on a future episode. And that'll probably take up the rest of my year, because I'm probably just going to play that nonstop.
I did think about a game that I have been playing, actually. And I didn't think of it because I haven't played it for more than an hour. So we don't have to ruminate on it too much. But Mega Man Battle Network.
Ah, yes.
Jacking in.
Yes, I have jacked in. I've completely jacked in.
But you jacked off to come do this episode, right?
I jacked off a while ago, yeah.
I think it's jacked out.
Jacked out.
Jacked out?
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry. Jesus. That's the other thing.
But yeah, I don't have a lot to say about it. Because again, I'm only like an hour in, so.
Yeah, I forgot that was coming out too. I'm morbidly curious about those because I've heard good things, but I miss those completely. It seems such a different departure from the normal Mega Man experience based on my understanding of it.
Guess you could say it's not a Mega Man game.
What was that?
Guess you could say it's not a Mega Man game.
Oh.
I have been going around saying I've been playing the Gen Z version of Mega Man.
Well, like I said, I'll have to take your word for it because I literally have zero experience with the series. So I'll look forward to when you play it more. I'll probably end up what is it on the Switch that you picked it up on, or
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I think it's on all modern stuff right now.
That seems logical. So I'll probably end up doing that if there's a sale or anything. But cool. All right. Well, if you guys don't have anything else, let us dive into the conversation proper. When I introduced the episode at the top, we're going to be talking about the Final Fantasy series as a whole. We're just going to have a kind of generic discussion on what we think the series actually is. Like I said, there's a lot of noise around Final Fantasy 16 coming out. People are kind of freaked out, kind of concerned, because it looks a lot more on the action side versus the traditional kind of turn-based or slower-paced Final Fantasy that we might be accustomed to. Although 7 Remake was a little bit more faster, but I'm sure all these topics will come up. And just to get kind of a baseline knowledge about what we're going to be talking about, I decided to go to the ultimate source of knowledge on the internet, Wikipedia, and ask Wikipedia, see what it had to say about the Final Fantasy series as a whole. And when I searched the Final Fantasy series on Wikipedia, the sentence I got is a mouthful, with it being defined as a Japanese science fantasy anthology media franchise. What the hell? So that is the way they've chosen to describe it, whoever wrote that article. And apparently it was approved by Wikipedia. I have no idea. As we try to explain what it actually is at its basic level, we can establish a couple things that we do know. The series was created by legendary game maker Hironobu Sakaguchi. He called the game his Final Fantasy, as it was his last-ditch attempt to make a game that would break into the gaming industry. I believe we were kind of talking in the chat that the rumor or the kind of myth that was going around was that it was called that because this was literally going to be Square's last game, but it was more that Sakaguchi was going to leave the industry and return to college if this game wasn't successful. And it was very successful because we are 16 mainline games and infinite number of games later in the series in the year 2023, year of our Lord. It drew inspiration from other notable games at the time, such as Dragon Quest, The Legend of Zelda, and Ultima. The first game was released on December 18th, 1987, and went on to spawn a franchise that is about to release its 16th mainline entry, but does include, like I said, an almost uncountable number of spin-off games, television and movie media, books, merchandise, memorabilia, memorable characters, and a passionate fan base. Several other Square Enix series would launch off of Final Fantasy, including Kingdom Hearts, Mana Saga, just to name a couple. So with that out of the way, gentlemen, I just want to let's start this conversation. I want to ask you guys. I asked you on because I know I've had conversations with Final Fantasy about Final Fantasy with both of you. So I just want to toss it to whichever you guys want to go first and just see what everybody's experience with Final Fantasy is here. Except Keith is signaling me in the window. Go right ahead.
I do want to just preface the beginning of this episode, as you were telling me, we are gathered here to talk about the discourse of Final Fantasy 16, correct? And I just want to say that, like, people have been complaining about Final Fantasy games for like over 30 years now, so it's really nothing new.
Facts.
End of podcast.
All right. Thank you guys for coming. Please stop by the Patreon and subscribe, and we'll see you on the internet. Yeah, no, but no, you are right. It seems that no matter what Square does, they can't do anything to make everybody happy. So I feel like that's kind of you're exactly right. That's the situation we've been in for 30 years. It's nothing new.
I was just before recording this podcast, I was having a side conversation with another friend about Final Fantasy 9. And they said, like, oh, a lot of the fan base kind of seems torn about that one. And I'm like, well, yeah, because a ton of people, including myself, basically jumped on board around Final Fantasy VII, and those people, for the most part, probably enjoyed Final Fantasy VIII. I can't say, but then for them to go back to more of like the traditional fantasy RPG style of the first handful of games, kind of left those newer people in the dust, while like old heads were like, "Oh yeah, this is pretty fucking awesome." And so it's always kind of, I think with every release, it's kind of been polarizing since, I would say maybe since 7.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, Chris, I saw you signaling. Were you going to say something?
I just wanted to say, first off, just so I can be a cunt here, the Final Fantasy description, like that is like the commonality. That's the common mythos that's explained, but they've also kind of gone back on that and said, we just wanted to use the letters FF.
Interesting.
And Final Fantasy sounded cool. So there's some truth to a lot of what's put out there in terms of Square being in financial trouble or Sakaguchi, leaving the industry. But ultimately, like the name Final Fantasy that they settled on, it's because they're like, yeah, we just wanted to have an alliteration, and the letters F look cool. So FF was something that they just worked on from the beginning.
If I remember right, I think the working title for a while was Fighting Fantasy.
It was, yes.
That is correct.
Yes, that's correct, yeah. So like the Final Fantasy thing came in later. Maybe that could have been inspired, I don't know, but they were always going to do an FF thing. That was always the idea. Second of all, and on our Patreon over at Retro Hangover, we have a Final Fantasy ranking episode where we rank all the Final Fantasies except for the online ones, which I'll kind of touch on in this episode, why we didn't do that, or why I wouldn't allow that more so, because it's my podcast and I do what the fuck I want. But we kind of came to the conclusion on that. It's like, as Final Fantasy fans, it's weird that we claim to be fans, but yet somehow hate the majority of the games. And
Yes.
that seems to be Final Fantasy fandom in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, I agree 100% with both what you guys said. My experience is similar to Keith's. I came to the series with 9 and have played pretty much everyone from 7 onward. I don't really have any experience with the older titles. So everything 7 onward is kind of like what my view of Final Fantasy is. I think my point of view is even more a little bit different, because to me, Square is the Kingdom Hearts company, not the Final Fantasy company. And that might be sacrilege to some people, but that's what I grew up loving more than Final Fantasy. I mean, you listen to one episode of my podcast and you basically know I'm the high priest of Tetsuya Nomura at this point, just spreading the good word of him everywhere I go. But yeah, I would kind of agree with like kind of what, and I guess we're just going to start going here because Keith brought up some interesting points that when I played Final Fantasy 9 first, but when I went back and played 7 and 8 and played 10 and then 12 and then 13, 9 to me kind of really feels like the point where things started to feel a little bit different, because like you said, they went back to that classic fantasy route. Even though I don't really have any experience with that, you can just tell that game is drastically, maybe not drastically, but it is different than 7 and 8 that preceded it, and it is different than 10 that came after it. So it really feels to me like 9 is kind of where I see the dividing line, and 9 is also kind of where shit kind of started to get a little bit crazy at Square during that time. You had the disaster that was the Final Fantasy Spirits Within movie. Tetsuya Nomura was working on like 47,000 different projects, and all while cooking up Kingdom Hearts and working with Disney. The executives at the time were like hanging out in Hawaii doing God knows what, spending way too much money. The company was trying to merge with Enix at the time. So around that time of 9 and 10, there was just a lot of really crazy stuff going on at Square.
I like to call that era of Sakaguchi the Hollywood Gooch. He put on the black NWO shirt and the bandana and the sunglasses and hung out in Hawaii, wrote scripts.
He found his inner Kojima.
Yeah.
Definitely.
That's essentially what happened, right? Because I think somewhere in between Final Fantasy 1 and 5, because you can see it in 6, he's like, I want to make movies. And then he got to make a movie, and he's like, we all found out he should not have been making movies, and he accepted it, so credit to him. But so did Square, so he was no longer with them shortly after that, too. So, yeah. Hopefully he got enough hookers and blow while he was there, because I mean, he certainly made a ton of money and was living the high life.
Right.
Well, I made a joke off air to Eric saying that, like, well, you know, at least when he basically got shit canned, at least he was in Hawaii.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was talking to Keith about, and I posted on social media, I picked up a 400-page book about the creation of Kingdom Hearts, of the Kingdom Hearts series. And I'm about 150 pages into that book, and it goes really heavy into a lot of the details of Square in that like late 90s, early 2000s period. And yeah, man, Sakaguchi was just like, nobody at the company could challenge him because he was Sakaguchi. He was like the visionary, the creator. So they basically just let him do whatever the F he wanted. So he went to Hawaii with like a budget for this movie and with a budget with how much he's going to spend. And he basically like just spent on whatever the fuck he felt like. And then the movie failed to make more than double of what it cost them to make. Yep. So yeah, what a legend, man. If you're going to go out, that's definitely the way to go out for sure.
He's like the Icarus version of Miyamoto.
Interesting.
If you want to, because I mean, if you think about it, like Miyamoto put Nintendo on the map. Miyamoto made Nintendo what Nintendo is today.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's any denying that. But you know, Yamauchi stayed in control of Nintendo. He always had the thumb on there. He was the ultimate disciplinarian. You look at Sakaguchi, and Square was essentially like, okay, like you in Sakaguchi. Let's be upfront about this. He made Square the success that Square was, the juggernaut that Square became. I don't know if necessarily I would call him a juggernaut anymore, but during that time, they're definitely like, they could do no wrong. They were darlings in the American market. They were dominating the Japanese market, but there was no real over dominating factor over there at Square. So like they said, okay, Sakaguchi, like you get everything you want. So essentially, like when I say the Icarus version of Miyamoto is that like you had these wings and you just see how far you could go and try to fly towards the sun. Miyamoto has kind of just, I don't want to say known his place because that's like kind of derogatory in a way. But like Miyamoto's like, I just want to make games. That's his ambition. He just wants people to have fun with video games. Even to the detriment, if you go back and look at the Wii Music demonstration in E3, like he's a big kid, and Sakaguchi's like, I want to be a movie guy. And anyway, that's the difference. Is one person was attached to creating fun, the other person was craving to make stories and just got overly ambitious and almost took an entire company down with him.
And I think too with Miyamoto, especially around the later end of the Super Nintendo and into the N64, was he was trusting a lot of more or less newer people with some of the bigger projects, you know.
Yeah.
I can't remember the names off the top of my head, but I think like Tezuka was starting to work on Zelda was like his priority for a while. And Miyamoto was still working on those projects, but he was more or less kind of like in the background, but he was still doing stuff. Whereas Sakaguchi just kind of seemed to have an iron fist over Final Fantasy for quite some time, up until he started basically working on the Spirits Within.
I mean, to his credit, he took a step back starting really with Final Fantasy VI.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, that's when Nomura kind of started stepping up into the limelight a little bit more.
Yoshi P. That's when he really started stepping up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's with Final Fantasy VI.
Has he been with Square that long?
Yeah.
Holy shit. I didn't know that.
And that's even more interesting too, because as you kind of read the history of Square, like Sakaguchi had these people that he'd worked with basically for most of these games. So it was kind of surprising that a couple of these guys were able to like kind of break in and earn his trust. But I mean, by the mid 90s, like Tetsuya Nomura was basically like Sakaguchi's like fixer guy. He would just throw Nomura on any project that he felt like needed help, and that's what led to him working on Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII. He, for whatever reason, they didn't put him on 9, but it seems to me that they had like a separate team working on 9 while their A team was working on 10. And Nomura at that time too, he was working on what else were they working on? That they were working on Parasite Eve. They were working on
Play Online.
Yeah, there's just so much other shit at the time. But
Final Fantasy gave Square free reign to do whatever the fuck they wanted on the PlayStation. Sony was like, oh, you just made us a ton. You basically put us over our competition with ease with Final Fantasy VII. So whatever you want to do, go for it. And so Square was just pumping games out nonstop.
Yeah, they made a racing RPG called Racing Lagoon.
What a wild concept. Let me touch on that for a second, because you guys are a couple years older than me. At the time when 7 came out specifically, 7 was a game changer in the industry based on my understanding of video game history, everyone's nostalgic love for it. Were you guys old enough to kind of remember the hype around that as the release date for 7 was approaching? Because I didn't really hear a lot about it. I would have been 5 or 6 years old at the time, but if you guys are a little older than me, I would have imagined that they were pushing that game pretty heavily.
Yeah, it's kind of weird, because it was, when you think back to it, and even now, I mean, you watch a sports event, right? Like today, and you'll watch like an NFL game, and you get ads for like Call of Duty or something. Not too out of place, kind of the same target audience, more or less, right? But in the 90s, in late 96, early 97, and you're getting these ads for this Japanese role-playing game on your sports events on like MLB or like NFL or whatever. Thinking about it now, it was like, what the fuck were they doing? But as a kid, it never really crosses your mind. And I very vividly remember, sitting in the living room with my parents, like watching a Packers game, and they had whatever old white dude announcing the game, talking about like a game so far ahead of its time that it could only come out in a time like today. Final Fantasy VII on your PlayStation coming soon. Like it was yeah.
They were having John Madden do ad reads in the middle of the football games, basically.
Look, this guy with this giant sword. Look, he takes it and he hits the monster and it does the damage. And when he does more damage than what like the damage can take, he dies.
Now
that's what you gotta do.
Now what you want to do is, when your health is getting down to 0, you're gonna want to take a potion. So it was like, I very vividly remember seeing, Ares. Here we go. Can I just preface, if we talk about 7 a lot, I might accidentally call her Ares. That's fine. It's wrong. I know it's very wrong. That's just how I said it as a child.
Don't worry about it. If we talk about 8, I'm about to call Squall Leon all day long, so don't even worry about it.
He kills zombies.
He does kill zombies, yeah.
But I remember seeing Aerith, in front of the pipe that's leaking Mako energy. I remember the train scenes, and they just showed like a lot of the FMV sequences, and it was, yeah, man, it was weird. I didn't have like context for the franchise. My first Final Fantasy was actually Mystic Quest, and for whatever reason, that just never. Because you think about the box art of Mystic Quest, and it's Mystic Quest, huge letters, and then like at the top it says like Final Fantasy in like smaller letters or whatever. It's got like this like guy on a mountain holding a sword, I think. It's very like Art Deco-ish kind of. Mm-hmm. So Final Fantasy was not like, for whatever reason, I just did not think of that as a Final Fantasy game, even though it's a lot closer to what Final Fantasy games were back then. And so when I played through Final Fantasy VII, I was like, oh shit, Mystic Quest is a Final Fantasy game. And then you kind of go into, at the time, AOL chat rooms, and you go to chat rooms dedicated to Final Fantasy stuff. And you ask the question like, oh, how was this stuff connected? And then you find out it's not. And then you find out about all these other games. And without Final Fantasy, to be honest, I would have never learned about emulation. But yeah, I mean, Final Fantasy VII was a big deal. At least it was for me. Going back to your original question, a lot of my friends who were not into RPGs, because again, I was playing other stuff. I was playing like Earthbound, and I said Mystic Quest, Super Mario RPG. My friends weren't playing that stuff, but they played Final Fantasy VII. They hated it, but they played Final Fantasy VII because it was so you couldn't get away from it. So that's how I remember it, at least.
I'm a little bit different because my experience with Final Fantasy starts with Final Fantasy. I didn't play Final Fantasy when it was new, though. I'm not quite that old. I mean, when I like the difference is like 3 years, so oh wow, that old. But I played the original Final Fantasy in like 1992 at like my I want to say like after school care sitter's home, because we would walk from elementary school to the sitter's house, and then our parents would pick us up, and they had Final Fantasy. I'd never seen or heard of this game, but you could create these characters and you could do these things with it, and I was enamored with it. So that was something I really got into, and I got Final Fantasy for Christmas one year, and then I went to my Blockbuster video and played some Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. I got to play more of that because I had a friend in Wisconsin, Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, who had a copy of Mystic Quest, and he lent it to me, and I got to play some of that and rented some Final Fantasy 2. And then got into Final Fantasy 3, and then it was off to the races. And it's like, oh yeah, I'm a big RPG fan now because I love Final Fantasy 3. And as you can like anyone can understand, everyone was looking forward to the next Final Fantasy. The N64 was on the horizon. 3D graphics were there. We were psyched. There was this website I was going to called RP Gamer, or RPGAMER, which I think still exists. And yeah, this was like 1995, 1996 internet. So way different. And of course you see the video, or not like the video, because streaming video was almost unheard of back then, but you would get like the images of, Terra and Locke and Shadow fighting this monster on hardware. And it's like, oh, it's coming to the N64. And then you'd find out, oh no, it's coming to the system called the PlayStation. Even 1997, it's like, I don't know what the fuck a PlayStation is. I had no fucking idea. I'm like 12. All I know is there's this. I go to the arcade, and Cruisin' USA and Killer Instinct are telling me to buy the Ultra 64, and that's what I fucking want. But so it's like, oh, I'm going to look into the PlayStation now, and all of a sudden now Final Fantasy VII is on MTV, and I didn't watch MTV. Like, I'm not a loser, and why am I saying I'm not a loser? I am the loser that doesn't watch MTV. And you see it in movies, and here I was, like, for a while, just like everyone else was playing all these more mainstream games. Everyone was more into sports, and I started to realize, this is when I really started to realize that my gaming preferences were niche, and being a fan of a Final Fantasy game was extremely niche. No one played Final Fantasy 3 for the Super Nintendo. No one knew what it was. Everyone today wants to tell you they did. They're lying, because I remember back then, and no one did. Absolutely nobody did. No one knew what the fuck a Chrono Trigger was either. So they can get off this high horse and be like, I love that game back then. No, you did not. You absolutely didn't. I know. And
I remember, Chris, it's the greatest JRPG of all time.
Yeah. Yeah, everyone will tell you that. And they'll tell you they have really great memories of it, despite the fact that they were 1 when it came out.
I remember Frog. I remember the Frog.
Yeah. But so Final Fantasy VII comes out, and I'm all hyped for it because it's Final Fantasy. I got Tobal number 1 because it came with the Final Fantasy VII demo. Super psyched, was super into it, and it came out, and I just digested that thing. And I've said this on previous podcasts, I think with Keith, and when we were on Still Loading, it's like that it just has this burned into my memory of sitting in my room, eating Pizza Hut Supreme Pizza, because it was the first time I developed taste buds and was able to move past pepperoni and extra cheese, and playing Final Fantasy VII up in my room. And I still equate Final Fantasy VII with the taste of Pizza Hut Supreme Pizza. It's terrible.
Hell yeah.
But and just loving it. But then I started realizing, and because like I'm young, I'm stupid. Like a lot of other people like this. So now I like to be on the outside, and I like to be totally not weird by being weird. And I have to start rejecting this. This is not my Final Fantasy. This isn't. Where's the high fantasy? Where's the dragons? Where's the castles? Where's the kingdoms? Where's the prince and princesses and kings and shit? It's not here. It's not a real Final Fantasy. I'm very upset, even though it was more just me trying to lash out that I just lost what I thought was, mine and my small group of friends, and now it'd become everybody else's. And I was still on the outside, even though my personal hobbies and my personal tastes were becoming mainstream, but I myself was not mainstream. So it was more of a struggle and kind of rejection against that, which kind of sucked for me. But that was the Final Fantasy VII experience. And do I think, kind of to Keith's point, was Final Fantasy VII important? Does it go back that far to, what really is a Final Fantasy? And like, yeah, absolutely. Because I know I was doing it with Final Fantasy VII, saying, this is not my Final Fantasy VII anymore. This is not my Final Fantasy. It's been going on since then. Do I think there's a stronger case for that question now? Yeah, but I think it's a much more leveled mindset. Back then, it was just, gaming was still relatively small, and we didn't truly understand concepts of games, mechanics. We didn't probably know any of the developers, for the most part, who made these games, what their names were, where they came from, what their backgrounds were, how it related to other games. We couldn't connect those things. Just because gaming in and of itself, even though it technically became mainstream, like on MTV and in movies and everything like that, it was still niche. RPGs, yeah, Final Fantasy VII brought it into the limelight, but like, look at any other RPG that's not Final Fantasy and look at its sales numbers. Most of it's dog shit because it just wasn't there. So we were learning. We were learning a lot. We were learning it very quickly. And it still took us a long time to learn the ins and outs of it, to really being able to really formulate what we thought in terms of what our gaming identity was, for lack of a better word.
Eric, do you mind if I hijack your podcast for a moment?
If you would like to, that's why I brought you guys here. So nobody wants to hear my voice.
I love your voice.
Thank you.
So this is something I've kind of been, for the past 2 years, I've been tossing around in my head about the thought about the, I guess, so to speak, rise of Square in the mid-90s, and also the advent of, those
Advent Children? Sorry. I had
materia cancer. And kind of the advent of, the cutscenes and stuff like that, and the graphics, higher fidelity graphics and stuff like that. And Square already had, as far as Final Fantasy goes, it's like what you were saying earlier, Chris, that Sakaguchi was very much into writing these stories almost as if they were movies, right? So they had that part down. But now, with graphics, they can really bring it all together in a way that is wrapped in a nice, beautiful, well, for at the time, beautiful gift. It's very easy on the eyes, it's very impressive. It's what drew most people in to Final Fantasy VII, just going back to what I said earlier about the commercial and just showing off the cutscenes and not the actual game. So do you think those sales numbers has a lot to do with just how fucking good Square got with the technology of the PlayStation?
Well, I was going to say,
absolutely.
I think so. And the surprising thing is, I'm glad you kind of brought that up, because even back in the day, you were looking at the kind of stuff that Square was doing. Like, I remember seeing the intro movie to Final Fantasy IX for the first time, and that was mind-blowing. It was mind-blowing. That was in 2000, 1999, 2000, that game came out.
2000.
If you look at what was going on around the same time, and around the time that Final Fantasy X came out, and you had The Spirits Within being worked on, Pixar released Monsters, Inc. in 2001. And I remember the stuff that Square was doing, like, being that good. I mean, anybody here, this is a different series, Kingdom Hearts, go and look up the secret ending for the secret ending movie for Kingdom Hearts 1. And look at how good that shit was back in 2002, 2003. So, I mean, Keith, you're absolutely right. They were firing on all cylinders with that. And I think Chris, I just listened to your Final Fantasy 13 episode, and one of the things I did agree with you on that game still today looks incredible. Looks incredible. Like anything that Square has done has always been like visually pretty stunning. At least a bar above what everybody else is doing.
Yeah, because as a kid, looking forward to the next Final Fantasy, part of the excitement was seeing how much better Square, how much better the presentation and the thought and care that Square put into the presentation was. I'm not a huge graphics person these days. I would say I never really cared that much about graphics, but like the Final Fantasy games were a showpiece back then. And for the longest time, that's how I always thought of them. Like if there was a new Final Fantasy coming out, this was going to be the best looking game on that console, period. And I think there's something to be said and something that really goes into the fact that Square was somehow able to get all that they could out of whatever machine they were working on at the time. I don't know how much of that holds up now. I haven't played a lot of the newer Final Fantasies, so I don't know if 15 is like technically impressive or not compared to like a Horizon Zero Dawn or something. You know what I mean?
15 was its own train wreck. That could be a whole episode by itself. So
Yeah,
I'm just speaking on the graphical
PS3
side of things.
game. And,
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, I think that was a huge selling point for a lot of people, and it's probably why Square succeeded so much and outsold a lot of the contemporary RPGs that were out at the time. And I've just been thinking about this because it's a topic that I would like to cover on my own show at some point, on just how Square was even able to do this. Because they definitely had like a style. They fucking figured it out, and I don't know what magic they were working to be able to pull that off. So I just didn't know if you guys ever felt the same growing up, like just looking forward to what show-stopping game that they were going to put out.
Well, like I was saying with MTV, when you go back to those advertisements that you saw in the movie theater, that you saw on MTV, that you saw in those more mainstream outlets, they weren't of Cloud and his blocky ass running around the map.
Yeah.
They were the movies. They were the cinematic movies, which that was still an entirely new concept. And Square, even with Final Fantasy VII, even as aged as those movies are, in 1997, that was mind-blowing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, people hadn't seen anything like that. And if you had an N64, you weren't going to get that until they figured out how to compress the shit out of videos with Resident Evil 2, like much later on. And it was like, they had these advertisements that said if this was going to be on an N64, you would have to buy like 512 cartridges or some shit like that, right? And that's all because really of the cinematic movies, when you really sit down and think about it. And that's what Square was using to push those games, was the beautiful cinematics. And I know a lot of people will say, hey, it's Final Fantasy VII that did that. It's like, no, you weren't paying attention to Final Fantasy VI then, or you weren't looking at it critically enough or considering enough what was going on. Square wanted to move into the cinematic realm. They wanted to make showpieces, as Keith said. They wanted to make the top of the line experience for the gaming medium in terms of storytelling for their market. And it's I know it seems like, you know, you look back at the American market, you know, us as Americans, and you think to themselves, how did Square afford this? Especially back then. But that's because they're making money hand over fist in Japan. Like they were just dominating. So they could afford this shit. They could afford to get the best movie production studios to make the best cinematic experience on the PlayStation, when the Japanese market in terms of video gaming was the video game market, because Western developers in the mid to late 90s were absolute dog shit. They sucked. Like the only game in town was the Japanese market. So if you were significant there, you were significant everywhere. And still, like Final Fantasy VII to this day, I think it's the second best selling PlayStation game, period, with the number one being Gran Turismo or Gran Turismo 2, one of the two games. And that's just because racing is big in Europe, so of course they're going to buy it, and it's a great game. I mean, I don't want to talk down about Gran Turismo. That's an entirely different topic for a different day.
Right.
And it's phenomenal. But yeah, you're right, Keith. 100% right. Like the sales I think are directly tied. As you said, your friends got into it. They bought it. Why did they buy it? They didn't buy it because they saw a Duplo kid running around on a pre-rendered background. They saw it because Cloud was like, you saw this face going down at a high velocity rate with all this like beams of light going behind them. It's like, oh, that's so cool. That's why they fucking bought it. And then when they played it, like, oh,
I can't move my guys. Why can't I move my guys?
Yeah, no. Can I go back to like shooting things, please? Yeah, that's what it is.
I never thought about that, and that's a terribly interesting point you made about it. Really did, like you said, feel like magic because at the time, I certainly don't remember anything else being of that caliber. And like I said, as I've gone back and played more nostalgia stuff, I was like, oh, this doesn't look quite as good as I seem to remember it did back in the day. But the stuff from Square from back then, I say, especially those kind of animated cutscenes, like, yes, it's old. It was 30 years ago. We've obviously advanced a lot further than we were back in the day. But that stuff back in the day was absolutely mind-blowing. And you're right, it did have a certain magic to it. So I wonder if that kind of contributes to the whole... Because still, even back then, the industry wasn't as homogenized, corporatized, as ruthlessly efficient as it is nowadays. Nowadays, we have established practices of doing things. Everybody works more or less in like the same engines. I mean, video games is still like a really fucking hard thing to pull off. Most of the time, it's just kind of throwing stuff together and hoping that it works. But it's more efficient now than it used to be, and everyone's kind of on the same page, has the same kind of like breadth of experience. Just depends on like how much money are you willing to throw at it to make it look as good as it did. So I wonder if just like maybe the result of the rest of the industry catching up to what Square was doing just maybe took a little bit of that polish off there and be like, oh, okay, like now some of the stuff Sony's doing looks pretty good. I mean, you could pick up most any game off the shelf now and be reasonably impressed by what it looks like, although now the conversation on Twitter is apparently we're bitching that stuff's not in 60 frames per second, but to me, I don't really care. I want to turn my machine on, machine go burr, and I play the video game and I'm happy. But that's a whole probably another conversation that we could have. But yeah, I never thought of that kind of magic aspect. That's exactly what it was. It's like Disney magic, but was the Square magic.
One of the other things too is back then, a lot of the companies were very protective of the people that were working on their games. And so nowadays you see a lot more cross-pollination and kind of people, going over to another studio and not maybe, putting in a ton of input on a new game, but maybe, giving a little pointers here and there, and, they might get their name in the credits or something like that. So I think there's a lot more of that going on now than there was in the 90s.
Oh, definitely.
Just imagining Miyamoto like ending up at Activision Blizzard would blow my mind.
Oh, it's just, look, the Japanese companies back then, they were probably worse than Activision Blizzard is today. You want to talk about crunch? And the other thing is like, I don't know, I don't want to speak too much to it because I'm not too well versed in it. From what I understand, you look at creation notes, as long as let's keep on the Final Fantasy topic, as I think you mentioned, I don't know if it was off air or like at the very beginning, like you're talking about like the Final Fantasy developers just smoking cigarettes for like 14 hours a day, and then like on the one day off they go to the bar and get plastered, and then get back like the next day hungover as fuck, sleeping in the office, and then going back to programming again nonstop. And you were saying like video games weren't very efficient. I do think that's more of an Amerocentric point of view, because Western developers, they were horribly inefficient.
You're probably right. Yeah.
They weren't very efficient whatsoever. They were still trying to figure it out. They were catching up. They're more on the PC side of development at that time, and PC gaming just wasn't a thing really. I mean, you had Doom.
I was gonna say
Doom.
I was just gonna say that, and look how Sonic 2 ended up.
Yeah, because the Japanese developers were like, you lazy fucking Americans, why aren't you working 18 to 19 hours a day? But that's how it was. Like, the Japanese development mindset appears to have been, and I'm not a Japanese developer, so I can only go by conjecture and assumptions, work your ass until you die and get no credit for it.
Didn't the composer for Chrono Trigger like almost fucking die composing that game? Didn't he like go to the hospital and like was like bleeding and just almost he was like passed out on his office floor?
Yeah, Mitsuda almost worked himself to death. That's why Uematsu even had to came in on that, because Mitsuda damn near died. That was just Japanese development culture. So it was very efficient. They could crank out sequels like no one's business. Like Final Fantasy 2 came out less than a year after Final Fantasy. Dragon Quest 2 came out less than a year after Dragon Quest. They would see a success, they make a ton of money, and it was immediate like, go make another one now, and it better be out soon. That was the Japanese development cycle. It was vicious as fuck. And that's just how things were back then.
Capcom just shit out Mega Man games like nothing. like that, so quick.
Yeah. 2 different series at the same time, too.
I put in my notes like some kind of common themes that Final Fantasy games tend to kind of follow. Like you find one or more of them more or less in every game in the series. For example, there's like a Warriors of Light motif, heroes rising up against darkness to kind of save the world. There's normally one or more like warring factions that are like fighting for like control. There's usually a lot of like political drama and strife and stuff like that. Most of the Final Fantasy games, I would say, have a pretty good, like, memorable core cast of characters, maybe with the rare exceptions here and there. But are there certain things that you guys, identifiers that you guys look for in Final Fantasy games to be like, hey, like, that makes it a Final Fantasy, or that's a Final Fantasy thing, or I recognize that from stuff that Square's been doing for 30 years now?
I just went off on a rant, so I'll let you go again, Keith.
There's always a Cid and there's always a Chocobo.
Not always.
End episode. You're right. I missed that.
I guess there wasn't a Chocobo in Strangers of Paradise. Technically not a Square Enix game, but...
Well, did you play the DLC? I didn't. There could be.
Oh, shit, you're right.
We have to go back.
What are some common themes of Final Fantasy? I mean, it depends, right? If the debate is, what is really a Final Fantasy? And you're as disgruntled and jaded as someone like, and cynical as someone like I am, I can go back and I can say, I don't feel like there's really been a Final Fantasy with a common through line since Final Fantasy X. And if I want to say what defines that, I would have to look to other series and start there and kind of build my argument from there. And that's why I wanted Keith to go first, because I'm going to rant forever. Sorry. But like, if you look at Mario, take a look at Mario, for example. What's a Mario game? So,
that's what I'm saying, man. People shit on Super Mario Brothers 2 USA all the time, and I'm like,
it's a Mario game.
Man, they've all been different. And there's so many Mario games now. I know this isn't a Mario podcast. There's so many Mario games now that took ideas from that game. So it's more of a Mario game than any of the other ones. All right, rant over. Sorry,
but let me. Yeah, I mean, we disagree slightly on that. But like, is Donkey Kong a Mario game? Nintendo sometimes says it, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they say it's a Donkey Kong game. It's not. It stars Mario. Is Mario Brothers a Mario game?
Oh, gee.
Because a lot of people, when they say the original Mario Brothers, they're not talking about Mario Brothers. They're talking about Super Mario Brothers.
Right.
So what's a Mario game? So I think if you talk to your common person, what's a Mario game? What's the through line? So the through line is it stars Mario. It has to star fucking Mario. It's a platformer. There's levels of some sort, but it's developed by Shigeru Miyamoto is in charge of it. It has a soundtrack by Koji Kondo. There's been evolutions over the years, but essentially there's power-ups. You can dash or you can walk. And the 3D ones have different ones. And even there's identifiers. So if you look at Nintendo, what they did with Mario Brothers is they realized Super Mario Brothers was different. So they put Super in front of it. Nintendo themselves didn't really accept Mario Brothers USA as Super Mario as a Mario game until much later. They kind of had to fold into it. In fact, that was a debate forever, whether or not that was a Mario game. Even with American fans, it was called Super Mario Brothers 2, because a lot of them, it came out like, I don't know, this is weird. And you can do that for a lot of sequels back then too, right? But when you go to like Mario 64, if you notice, the Bros is gone. So instead of being called Super Mario Brothers 64, it's called Super Mario 64. So even when they start getting into the 3D realm, they start separating how they title their games in a sense. So is Super Mario Brothers a same kind of line as the 3D Marios, which seemed a little bit different? I think Mario Odyssey isn't called Super Mario Brothers Odyssey. It's called Super Mario Odyssey.
Super Mario Odyssey, yeah.
I think
Super Mario Galaxy.
Yeah, Galaxy.
I think they
too.
dropped the brothers with World, right?
The Super Mario World, yeah.
Yeah, Super Mario World. Is it New Super Mario Brothers? New Super Mario Brothers.
I think
New
that's
Super Mario Brothers U.
I think that's
That
New
is,
Super
yeah.
Mario Bros.
Which are
yeah.
2D. So like the 2D still has the Bros. The 3Ds dropped it. So even there's a differentiation in there acknowledged by Nintendo. So what's really a Mario game? There's different paths. They separate them. They give them separate identifiers. So even if so how does this pertain to Final Fantasy? And why do I say like there hasn't been a real Final Fantasy since Final Fantasy X? Really, right? Or a through line, I'll say, because I mean, if Squaresoft calls it fucking Final Fantasy, it's Final Fantasy. I think we all accept that for the most part, right?
End episode.
Because you can't say
that's it.
yeah, it's not Final Fantasy. Oh, they called it Final Fantasy. Fuck you. Back and forth. But for the most part, what do you get with the Final Fantasy game? Okay, it was directed by Hironobu Sakaguchi, or he's an executive producer. He's overall in charge. You have a score written by Nobuo Uematsu, or Nobuo Uematsu is heavily involved. You have character art, at least promotional, done by Yoshitaka Amano, and then by Final Fantasy VII, everything was Tetsuya Nomura, but Nomura had been there since at least Final Fantasy IV, so he had been attached. What else do you have? You have a turn-based battle system, a single-player game, and that's an attack mechanic, an attack menu system that's conventional and all the same, and a leveling system that's generally familiar across the games. The only game where it's not is Final Fantasy II, but a lot of people, I won't say a ton of people, but there's people like me that would argue that Final Fantasy II isn't a Final Fantasy game. It's a saga game. So, like you get to that point, there's commonalities across all these things. Then you get to Final Fantasy XI. And when Final Fantasy XI came out, because they announced Final Fantasy 9, 10, 11 all in like the same day.
Right.
Like, hey, all these three games are all in development at the same time. I specifically remember people were like, this is not a mainline Final Fantasy game. This should be called Final Fantasy Online, because it does not share things with Final Fantasy. You can make the same argument in Dragon Quest X, a series that definitely you can see a through line in all of its games. The thing is once you get to Final Fantasy 12, that through line definitively ends. It separates itself thoroughly. You could say it started with 11. You could say it started with 12. But it thoroughly cuts itself off from basic shared commonalities with every previous Final Fantasy in terms of mechanics, in terms of experience points. 10 did this a lot too. So I'm not going to sit here and just champion 10 because I'm a cuck for 10. It's probably true. But 10 was still a single player turn-based experience. And by the way, all the Final Fantasy games, I know a lot of people are like, oh, it's a hallway. All the Final Fantasy games are fucking linear. Get off your high horse. They're all fucking linear. They all drive you in a direction. And just because you're on a 2D plane and you can see the world doesn't mean it really like alters it. Like it definitely funnels you and holds your hand for the majority of the experience up until a certain point. That is a Final Fantasy fucking experience. So knock it off at Final Fantasy X. And well, 13's really linear. But
It's a spicy take.
I don't think it's wrong.
I'm not touching it.
I mean, you're going to. That's why you're here.
Right.
But I mean, I think like you get to 12. 13 is the closest thing to being a traditional Final Fantasy since Final Fantasy X. Because 15 sure as shit isn't. It's an action game. 16 is Devil May Cry. At least that's what they're saying. But like, I have no issue if they're going to call like Final Fantasy Strangers of Paradise. Is that a Final Fantasy game? It's a Final Fantasy spinoff. I don't give a shit. That's fine. World of Final Fantasy. It's everything coming together. I don't give a shit. Kingdom Hearts. Is that a Final Fantasy game? It has Final Fantasy characters with Final Fantasy developmental staff, but it's an action game, even though it has a lot of Final Fantasy elements. Is that a Final Fantasy game? No, it's fucking not. Is Seiken Densetsu, that was called Final Fantasy Gaiden, a Final Fantasy game? No, it's a Secret of Mana game. Is Final Fantasy Tactics a Final Fantasy game? Kinda, not really. It's an ogre game. That's my take.
Okay. Oh, Keith, you wanna touch that spicy nacho?
Maybe. So what I've kind of been mulling over in my head is the fact that, and going kind of back to what I said earlier about my history with Final Fantasy VII, is that this is a series of games that, despite them having a number put after the title, is an anthology. None of the games have anything to do with each other, even though they do reference one another multiple times, right down to basically 9 just literally being the greatest hits of the series up to that point. Sorry, I'm just trying to put this all together in my head so that it makes sense.
Keith, don't you remember from when we were on Stranger of Paradise with Dave that I made the argument that they're fusing all the universes together?
It is all connected now, yes. So forget what I just said.
I blame Nomura.
But is it canon?
Okay, so, with that in mind, you look at each game, and even starting from the first to the second, even though presentation-wise, story-wise, although, hardware limitations aside, 2 has a bit more story than 1. Not much, but a little bit more. The mechanics, it's always about the mechanics. It comes down to the mechanics that really separates a lot of these titles. And for, the first 6 games, they weren't drastically different, but they were different. You get to 7, still kind of similar, but still mostly the same. And then you get to 8, and that basically is just fuck all. They threw everything out and did something completely different. But like in battle, it's the same. It's still the same. Yes, a menu pops up. It's very familiar, but all of the stuff in the back end is what you have to worry about.
Yeah.
So, and I think also, the whole thing with 8 too is, it was like the one and only time saw the success of the previous game and was like, oh, well, let's just kind of do that again. Almost exactly like the same art style, almost the same characters. Let's really fuck around with the plot though, and really change up the mechanics. And it almost seems like 9 was an answer to 8, because 8 did not. It sold very well, of course it did, but
9 wasn't kind of an answer. It was definitively an answer.
Well, yeah.
Right. Well, 9 was also kind of like a retrospective too. It was like Square was using this as like a game to kind of look back on where they'd come from, because they knew that 10 was coming. They knew that they were going to be going in a different direction. And we had 10, yes. We had Kingdom Hearts in the works. We had, and especially too, around this time when Sakaguchi was, smoking all the cigarettes in Hawaii, the reason that they finally stood up and were like, enough is enough, is that the game industry was becoming more corporatized at this point, and it was around this time that the Square executives had wanted to start making more. I forgot how they phrased it in the book, but they wanted to start capitalizing more off of like the characters and all this world that they spent all this time in, rather than just like, oh, okay, Final Fantasy VII's out and we're leaving it. You love those characters, but we're not doing anything else with them. And that's how we get to the point where we've got Advent Children and Dirge of Cerberus and Crisis Core and 17. There's probably more Final Fantasy VII spinoffs at this point than there are mainline Final Fantasy games. We get things like 10 and 10-2, which wasn't 10-2 the first time that a Final Fantasy game ever had a sequel. Is that correct? So to me, it was when that, and I'm not blaming corporatism, even though I 100% am down with the system, that they decided to start making more extended and kind of starting to milk them for a little bit more than, what they usually did. They stopped and moved on. They're like, oh, people really love the characters from 7. We can just milk that for all it's worth. And now look, 20 years later, here we are. We're remaking the games into something that is similar but different, and we've arrived at that point. And Final Fantasy 15 would be cool, but hey, what if it was a movie? And what if it was a mobile game? And what if there was like all these spin-off things you had to get the entire story to make all the money? I guess I'm not specifically blaming that the chase for money changed Final Fantasy, but I feel like I did have a lot. That point was a change in Square's thinking, and I can't help but feel like that calculus kind of played into the trajectory shift that we kind of saw.
Well,
I wish I was. Go ahead, Keith. I've had a huge rant. So.
Well, and I think you said, Chris, that 10 was kind of the point at when, to you, things kind of started to change and kind of branch off. Yeah. And even then, still looking like as I'm going chronologically through these early games, jumping from 9 to 10, like again, I'm going to kind of repeat myself. It was different, but it's the same. Mm-hmm. But when you zoom out, well, I shouldn't say zoom out. When you zoom in and you look at something like, Final Fantasy 15, which again, I haven't played. I don't have much context for it, but just using that as an example. When you look at 15, you play that, and then you go and play Final Fantasy 5. You're like, oh, this is fucking... Final Fantasy V is a bad example. That's a 2D one, so I'll use Final Fantasy X.
Okay, when you're done making your point, I'm going to make a counterpoint. Because
it's completely different. The systems are completely different. It's a different way of storytelling, very different character. The focus is very much different on the characters.
Yeah.
It's, and even just looking at the development of 15, I mean, that thing was a mess when it originally came out. At the point I'm trying to make, essentially, is that, what is a Final Fantasy? Is that there's really no straight answer because they've always been different. Mm-hmm. It's just that when you are living in it, when you're growing up with it, like the way Chris and I did, the differences aren't immediately noticed. But now that we're much older, 16 is out and people are like, well, this is all action. Well, that's kind of what Final Fantasy has been the past couple of years. Like, where have you been? It's been going that way for quite a long time now. And, going back to Final Fantasy X, where everybody's like, wow, this is like the best game ever. When that came out, everybody was like super fucking hyped for that game. And I was just kind of like looking at it. I'm like, well, this just kind of seems like more Final Fantasy to me. Like, I don't know how this is any better than the rest of them. Kind of the same. That's just my opinion, I guess. They share a lot more similarities than they don't, but also they're also very different. If any of that made sense.
My counterpoint is that Dragon Quest XI, Dragon Quest is not an insignificant series. It is a very significant series. Mm-hmm. If I went and played Dragon Quest XI, and then I went and played Dragon Quest IV, I wouldn't be like, what the fuck is this? I would still know it's a Dragon Quest game. Or vice versa. If I had not played a Dragon Quest game since Dragon Quest VI, or even Dragon Quest I, if I had played the original Dragon Quest, and then I came back and like, oh, I recognize all the themes that this game has. Because it's all apparent. The animation style is the same. The enemy monsters are the same. The whimsical music is still the same. It all shares these things. I know I'm just playing a very, very, very modernized version of the original game. You don't get that with Final Fantasy. And if you say Final Fantasy's been gearing in an action direction for some time, I mean, no, it went that way with Final Fantasy 15. It didn't go that way with 13. It was almost autoplay. Didn't go that way with 12. That was also autoplay. It was this weird online amalgamation disaster, in my opinion. A lot of people like it. I think it's horrible. But, you know, if you like it, you do you. It's okay to like a game, as Keith would say. But Final Fantasy 15 was not supposed to be a mainline Final Fantasy game. A lot of people forget that. It was supposed to be a spin-off of Final Fantasy 13.
Versus
part of the
13.
Versus 13. Part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis. That was like this big expansion of the Final Fantasy 13 universe. So like there's a reason why Final Fantasy 15, if people say this doesn't feel like a Final Fantasy game, there's a reason for that. It's because it wasn't supposed to be. It was never meant to be. In terms of being a mainline one, it's supposed to be a spin-off. But that also goes to kind of the point that that Eric was making in terms of the corporatization. That it just seems like for a while, especially when Square was, or maybe like the Japanese, more so the Japanese and the Japanese development was struggling in the early 2010s, late aughts, when just they couldn't find their footing. HD had just kind of caught them off guard, and they couldn't kind of meld with the mainstream anymore, and Western development had started just dominating. Is Square's answer to that was slap Final Fantasy on fucking everything, because I don't think they felt like anything else would sell. And instead of making Final Fantasy itself a franchise, they started looking to each installment, which we said on our Final Fantasy 13 episode, I think. Each installment became a franchise in and of itself. Final Fantasy 7 became a franchise. Final Fantasy 10 became a franchise. Final Fantasy 11 had expansions. In itself, it's kind of a franchise. 12 had an additional game on the DS, Revenant Wings. So you could say that was a franchise in and of itself. And it was part of the Ivalice franchise because it extended into the Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, and A2 on the DS. Final Fantasy 15 had a whole entire media circus around it, as Eric pointed out. Final Fantasy 14 is a monster into its own universe. Like, there's an entire universe that spins around Final Fantasy 14 to itself. That could just be World of Final Fantasy if you want to go down like the Warcraft shit. Each Final Fantasy since Final Fantasy X has not been viewed as an extension of a franchise, but rather a new franchise for Square to capitalize on, to farm from in order to make referential material for other side projects, is what you see on the online like mobile games, or other games like World of Final Fantasy, or other referential material. That's what Final Fantasy has become. And that came out of that time when Square couldn't find success in the HD realm. It's just because, hey, here's a new game. How do we sell shit? Final Fantasy, like putting that, Flex Seal on a fucking leaking tank. Just slap Final Fantasy on that motherfucker and it's going to sell. That's essentially what they fucking did. And you can't convince me otherwise.
I will push back on what you said about it not being action focused, because if I remember, and I know you don't count this, Chris, but it is a mainline Final Fantasy entry. Final Fantasy 14 came out 10 years ago, and it is action based, if I'm remembering
but
correct.
It's online. I don't think it's like a hack and slash. I think it's more like World of Warcraft.
It sure shit not turn based.
It's not. It's automated then. I haven't played it. I might be wrong. I played it like for 30 minutes. So I don't think I got in any fights. But it's like you walk up to something and it's like attack, and your character just goes, I'm
still sticking by my point.
And then it dies.
It seems like they've just been leaning more towards that way for a while now.
I think I can arrive at a little bit of a bridge like that. I think that I wouldn't say that all of those titles moving forward were action oriented, but they were attempting to be more, I guess, stylish and involved, instead of just having a row of characters just standing there. Like, yes, 12, you could basically program your character to do whatever you want, not touch a button, but they still kind of moved around. And 13, despite having a similar battle system with the paradigm system, like, it was pretty flashy and felt a little more like you weren't just watching characters like stand there, run up and attack a guy. So I think with like the flashiness and style of it was kind of moving in that direction. But yeah, 15 was really like the first time where we were kind of seeing, oh, where this is going. And then 7 Remake came out and we were like, oh, this is really where this is going. But honestly,
I'm fine with 7 Remake.
What?
I'm fine with 7 Remake.
I mean, I enjoyed it for what it was. I don't know enough about Final Fantasy 7 in general, so I enjoyed it as what I played it as. But really, too, like you said, they just started slapping Final Fantasy on everything. And honestly, I kind of blame the other Square tentpole franchise, Kingdom Hearts, for doing this, because Kingdom Hearts was the first time where they had a game series that continued on, and they had spin-off games, and they had games that started to tell all these different stories around all these different characters. And that partnership with Disney was really lucrative. And between that and Final Fantasy X, that kind of saved Square and made sure that merger with Enix went through. So they're like, oh, we have this other game where this is working. Why don't we try and milk like as much as we possibly can out of everything that we put on? And I would still argue to this day that I think Final Fantasy is the more recognizable, more powerful brand of the two.
Absolutely.
I wouldn't argue that at all, but the success of Kingdom Hearts, I believe, has had some influence on that, because if you look back at what Kingdom Hearts 3 was, that game is fully like full on action, like completely. Like you look at that and be like, oh, okay, and see what they're doing with 16 now and be like, oh, this is the direction that this is going. And we've kind of seen this coming, because, and the argument that they made for 16 and being this way is that I forget the guy's name who's in charge of it, but the director basically said that they're trying to attract a new generation of fans, and that fans are basically just not interested in battles where people stand around and run up and attack each other. Like, that's just not interesting. Like, you need to have flashing things going on the screen to hold our very, very short attention spans. Like, that's what it's come to. There are great games out today that give you the traditional Final Fantasy experience, if you want to call it that. Chained Echoes, that I know Dave has sang praises up and down Twitter, is a fantastic example of that, of a really, really like classic old school SNES RPG. It's fantastic. But we have to accept this moving forward, that this is where this is going. And they're slapping Final Fantasy on whatever this Devil May Cry game is going to be that's going to come out in June, which, by the way, I'm super excited for. And Keith also sold me, and I loved Stranger of Paradise, despite that having the Final Fantasy name on it. So, well, go ahead.
So I don't know which came out first, so if my chronology is fucked up, I don't care. But just so you know, is Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories? That is a Kingdom Hearts game, correct?
Yeah, that was on the GBA, and that's a whole different conversation.
But that's a Kingdom Hearts game.
Yes.
Why is that not Kingdom Hearts 2?
Because it was not chronologically called Kingdom Hearts. They didn't feel like it was big enough to be called Kingdom Hearts 2. They were only going to do numbered Kingdom Hearts titles on the main consoles.
I was going to say, it's a portable game. That's probably why.
Yes. So every other game that came out other than the big three, until they started porting all of them, because they were like, fuck, nobody's going to buy 3 because you have to own 17 different consoles to play all the games and figure out what this complex story is. So until then, 1, 2, and 3 were the only games the number of games were the only ones coming out on consoles. Everything else was put to the DS, the 3DS, the GBA, the PSP, mobile. That was a whole mess unto itself. So,
but my point more to it is that these are experiences that are still central to a series.
I would argue yes.
There's a reason. Like, I understand that you're saying, yeah, it wasn't on the console, so it was an official sequel. But like, there's a reason that each installment that is a sequel is a sequel. Now, of course, there's a through line in the Kingdom Hearts series. They have Sora, or something that is discussing Sora, or is around every nameless and heartless and nobody, and Xenohort, because everyone's Xenohort, and just, all that shit, right? There's a through line, there's a plot line that connects everything.
Yes.
And Final Fantasy doesn't have that. But it's still like, it's almost like they knew how to separate things when it needed to be separated. With Final Fantasy, I look at Final Fantasy 16, and this is not me saying that Final Fantasy 16 is going to be a bad game. I just want that to be like perfectly clear. It can be a highly enjoyable game. I think it's going to be a very well polished, enjoyable game. And if I ever get to play it, if it ever comes out in an Xbox, or I get a PC powerful enough to play it, I look forward to playing it. I do. But it's kind of like, if I shove feathers up my ass, I am not a chicken.
No, okay. I get what you're saying. I get it.
Just because they slap Final Fantasy on the title of the game doesn't mean it's a fucking Final Fantasy game.
Interesting.
And that's perfectly fine. They're calling it Final Fantasy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it has chocobos. A lot of fucking Seiken Densetsu has fucking chocobos. It's not a fucking Final Fantasy game.
Our guys has
Secret of
Cloud in
Mana or
it,
whatever the fuck.
So, I mean,
Yeah, so does a lot of so does Air Geese. Is Air Geese a fucking Final Fantasy game?
oh, is that how it's pronounced? I'm sorry.
I don't fucking know. I don't think Square knows. It's just look cool. But yeah, I mean, if Square calls it a fucking Final Fantasy game, you have to say, I guess it's a fucking Final Fantasy game on a technical level. But again, it's just Final Fantasy with fucking chicken feathers shoved up its ass, or chocobo feathers. I'll keep it thematic, and saying that this is a chocobo, and it's like it's a Moogle. It's a Moogle with chocobo feathers shoved up its ass, and it's saying quay quay or whatever the fuck they say now.
Stop giving them ideas, Chris.
That's probably going to happen now. But yeah, that's kind of how I view where it's at. It's trying to appeal to a mainstream audience, and I'm not faulting them for that. You want your game to sell. You want your game to be appealing. You want people to buy into that. That's the economy in which we live, and it's hard to fault them for doing that. But if you look at someone who's like an old time fan or old curmudgeons that are not their target demographic because we're all about to die because we're so fucking ancient, then yeah, you're not going to appeal to us when you're like, you know what? Why don't you make it more like Final Fantasy IV? It's because there's not 10 million of you. Shut the fuck up. That's the answer. And that's why it is. But is it do I view it as a typical traditional game in the Final Fantasy lineage or franchise? Absolutely fucking not. It's a complete diversion from it. And we want to sit here and we want to just kind of lament just kind of the corporate cynical world that we live in, then I want to embrace the fact that this isn't like a real Final Fantasy game. I want to slam it, even though I acknowledge it's going to be a great game. It just sucks, but it is what it is because they need to sell copies. They need to bring home the bread.
All I know is that my friends in 1997 who were like, I can't move my guys, they fucking love Final Fantasy now.
Yeah.
You finally move your guys. It only took us 20 fucking years.
And Eric and I were just on Dave's show talking about Strangers of Paradise, and obviously I fucking love that game. I think I said on that episode, it's more of a Final Fantasy game than a lot of Final Fantasy games. It is literally a remake of the first game for like the first 3 hours or something like that, and then it just kind of goes off and does whatever it wants to do, but still has Final Fantasy stuff in it. So yeah, I mean, I agree with Chris to a degree about all the ancillary sequels and stuff like that. I do like how I don't consume all of the ancillary stuff. Like, my favorite game in the series is still Final Fantasy VII. I don't give a shit about the 15 spin-offs on that game. I never needed to know what happened in Midgar at the end of the game. I don't care. I thought it was fine. And I think you can do that with any game in the series, and you don't really have to bother with any of the spin-offs or sequels or whatever unless you really want to. That's how I've lived my life. You can do whatever you want, so the only mistake I made was playing Final Fantasy VII Remake, and fool me once. So
got 2 more to go.
Great game. Not needed, but great game.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
But I mean, yeah, going back to Strangers of Paradise and just the battle system for that, it's somewhat similar to Final Fantasy VII, and obviously with Final Fantasy VII, they perfected basically what they were trying to do with Final Fantasy 15, and I think that's just kind of when I'm talking about kind of just the progression of the systems, I think Final Fantasy 16 is just another like weird development and take on I guess Strangers of Paradise, more or less. And that's why I'm all in on Final Fantasy 16. I want more of a battle system that's closer to that.
We can only hope that Jack shows up in Final Fantasy 16. That would be a blessing in disguise for sure. No,
it'd be an NFT microtransaction.
right.
Yeah.
God damn it. I'm gonna have to get into crypto, aren't I? It's the worst.
It's chaos out there.
It is chaos out there. It's chaos in the crypto markets. But yeah, no, I get what both you guys are saying, but again, I view myself as, I just think I have a different lens on Square than everybody because I'm firmly stuck in the Donald Duck as a wizard game camp. To me, a lot of the stuff, despite not looking like Final Fantasy, even stuff that I've kind of bashed over the years, like 13 or 15, I still feel like those games and even Kingdom Hearts to a degree maintain what I call like the spirit of Final Fantasy. And for me, yes, a game does have to be fun to play. I think that is important. But for me, the things I take away and the things I remember from Final Fantasy are the story and the characters. And to me, most of the stuff that I've played from 9 all the way through to hopefully 16 and all the Kingdom Hearts games retain the things about story and character that I've come to know and love from the series. And when Hironobu Sakaguchi was advising Tetsuya Nomura on creating Kingdom Hearts, he said, this can't be a Disney kids game. He's like, it has to be as complex as a Final Fantasy story. And to me, all the stories that I've played in Final Fantasy are like super complex and always take these like insane, even bizarre, some like crazy twists, like either towards the middle or towards the end, and just ends up telling a story that subverts your expectations and puts the characters through hardship that really makes you feel for them. It really makes you feel bonded to the characters that you play with. That happens in Kingdom Hearts. That's happened in pretty much all of the Final Fantasy games I play, even 15. I think 15, like I said, there's some kind of a video game in there somewhere, but even towards the end, after I got through playing that train wreck, the ending was still super emotional, and they still found a way to extract that emotion from me. So to me personally, that's what Final Fantasy is about. And as long as there's some kind of semblance of that narrative complexity and the attention to the characters and that character development and having a roster of characters that I genuinely can care about, and at the end, if they die or they live or get happy endings, I can feel emotional about it.
Everyone loves a happy ending.
Yeah. And not all the endings are happy. Some of the endings are super sad or super ambiguous
Super
on
messy.
purpose. Yeah, or super messy.
Super messy. And sticky.
Or end up perfectly like 7, and then we have, like you said, materia cancer. So, yeah, take that for what you will. But to me, that more than anything is what makes a Final Fantasy game a Final Fantasy game. And even, like I said, even so much as like Kingdom Hearts, like maybe that's just like a Square thing, whereas that's what I expect picking up a game that says Square Enix on it. I expect those complex story elements and characters that I can care about more and above everything else. And yes, the game does have to be fun to play, but those two things first above else for me.
Yeah, I think, honestly, it speaks more to the quality of the games that Square's putting out. I mean, I grew up with Square in the 90s, basically in their peak. And they are not doing that. They have not been that Square in a very long time. And I think it really just speaks to the quality of their games, first and foremost. So, I mean, we didn't really talk about if and when we even dropped out of the franchise, which is something I could speak to. I don't know if there's time for that. I won't get into that really, but
We got time if you want to.
I stopped playing after 9, and I didn't come back until 13 came out. And after 13, I didn't play any other one until Final Fantasy VII Remake. So, yeah, it's just kind of been touch and go because a lot of the games that Square was putting out just were not up to what they were doing in the 90s. And maybe that's nostalgia. But, when you see them put out stuff like, what was that, Forspoken, right? And, I don't know, there's some other game that came out last year, or the year before, that completely flopped.
It could sell 5 million copies and they call it a flop at Square, though.
True.
Was that Balan Wonderland is sticking in my head for some reason. Was that it, or is that a different?
No.
Yeah, it is Balan Wonderland.
Yeah, that game was bad.
Yeah, I mean, it just...
It was just a front for like Yuji Naka's insider trading.
That's true.
Trading.
Yeah. Yeah, I just don't associate Square with quality games anymore. So I also think that's a big part of why a lot of people just might not be excited for 16.
Yeah, 16 to me. I think that's the biggest reason I'm not excited for 16. It's not because I don't think it's going to be a bad game. I already said that. It's just because Square is just this soulless husk of nothing. Like what is Square now? I look back at the Square of the 90s and say whatever you want about Sakaguchi and how he just kind of pile drove the company he built up into the ground by smoking cigarettes out of a hooker's butthole in Hawaii. But he was creative. He was taking risks, and there's a lot of risk taking back then. And then it got to the PS2 era, and you could say Square stopped taking a lot of risks for the most part, especially once they combined with the Enix, and you stopped seeing that creativity flow. And where are we now? You know, Square they got IDOS, and now IDOS is gone. And I don't even think there's a lot. I mean, there's some good games. I'm not going to sit here and say they weren't good games that came out. Like Deus Ex Human Revolution is supposed to be very good. People love the Hitman series. The Tomb Raider remakes or reboots were phenomenal. But actually, when I think about it, a lot of the creativity coming out of Square in the past 10 years, outside of like the past 2 maybe, was coming out of its Western studios. Regardless, Square feels very much like a corporate husk, and I think that's why I look at Final Fantasy 16 and even 15 as games that don't really strike me as Final Fantasy games.
Or I was just going to say, I mean, I'm sure Eric can speak to Kingdom Hearts 3. I know you were excited to end that journey and you were very happy with that game, but at the end of it, I think you said something like you're just kind of like, this kind of also isn't exactly what I wanted.
Yeah, the characters, everything got wrapped up in a satisfying way that was still really emotional, but you're not talking about just one soulless, huskless corporation there. You're talking about 2. One that is the House of Mouse, Disney, extremely aggressive with their properties and extremely careful that anything they put their name on is going to make money. But yeah, for that reason too, it was very much a game that was, which is kind of why I'm surprised that maybe this might be something stupid I'm about to say, but I'm kind of surprised that Nomura is still there, because just reading more and learning more about him, that he is above and first and foremost above all, he's a creator. He wants to make video games, and he wants to make video games that make his fans think, and they are fun to play, and that can cause them to go into the internet forums afterwards and argue and talk about with each other about what's actually going on. And the fact that, you know, I feel like Nomura oftentimes gets a bad rap for quote unquote ruining Final Fantasy, but I do feel like it's more of like a Square problem than it is his problem, because he just tried to do what Sakaguchi told him to do. And Sakaguchi, when he left, basically passed the creative torch to Nomura and said, you have to be the guardian of this thing called Final Fantasy. And I'm amazed that he's been able to do anything with how obsessed and money grabbing that Square has been, you know, over the past decade or so, just looking at, you know, the whole Final Fantasy 13 universe they were supposed to spawn and how that collapsed. And Versus 13 was his passion project, and they just kind of axed it and nothing's really been said. But now he's like kind of bringing it back in Kingdom Hearts 4, and there's a bunch of just crazy shit going on with him. But yeah, it I think most of my hope died the day that the president of Square Enix came out, and they were like, it was after they sold off all the studios, and it's like, yep, we're investing in all the NFT things, and that's going to be the future, and it's going to make great gameplay experiences. And I'm just like, nah, it's not really going to do that. And it has me really scared for my personal preference favorite game series, what they're going to do to that, especially now that Disney is on the front lines of the culture war as well. So I don't know. I don't know what's going on anymore.
I don't know even how Disney's involved with Kingdom Hearts. No, I haven't really cared.
So we're going off on a tangent here. So they trust Nomura to be like the creative force behind it, but Disney owns all of the property. They own the characters, they own the world, they own the story. So if Disney ever gets pissed at Square and was just like, we're not doing this anymore, they can literally just take their ball and go home. So yeah, that was the price that Nomura paid to basically have the creative freedom that he wanted to. You know, you think you're shaking hands with Mickey, but really you're shaking hands with the devil. So,
but I go to I look at Square now, And, we said this kind of about Nintendo. And Nintendo's, they're a bunch of fucks too. I'm not here to like be like Nintendo's great, right? But they still have that magic. Nintendo still has that magic that makes you happy. You're like, well, yeah, they have their own hardware. They have Miyamoto. Sega found the magic again. And they're a bunch of corporate fucks. Like when you have the self-awareness to come out with a game where you murder your main mascot in a visual novel, or you have an entire series of games that's really good, but entirely self-aware and not totally serious with Yakuza, or you continue to back whatever Atlas wants to fucking do, which is usually quality for the most part. Like, Sega found an identity. And they don't feel, I mean, they're corporate, but they don't feel corporate, They get out there and they present themselves that way, or even like NIS America. I mean, these are all corporations at the end of the day. They're all trying to make money. But they don't feel like what Square has become, which seems to have this obsession with being relevant. It seems like Square, for the longest time, has always wanted to be Electronic Arts, and they're not. They're not Electronic Arts. But this even goes back to like Final Fantasy VII, when Square was Square Electronic Arts in the United States, always trying to partner. They want to be the king dick of the Japanese market, and who could blame them? But when you get to that position, yeah, you're going to get if you're trying to emulate EA, if you're trying to emulate Ubisoft, if you're trying to emulate these companies that have largely become soulless shadows of themselves, you yourself are going to become a soulless shadow of yourself. And I think, to me, that's what Square has become. That's what the Final Fantasy franchise has become. That's why when I look at Final Fantasy 16, I'm not hyped. I don't know if it's going to be a Final Fantasy. I don't know if it's going to be that's why I don't consider it. Okay. I know I just kind of mealy mouthed that there, but is it a Final Fantasy game? I don't think Final Fantasy 15 is. I know that like 14 and 12 and 11, I don't necessarily really consider to be that way, but they were created with different intentions, I think. A little bit different, like slightly different, not entirely different, but slightly different. There was still more creative force put behind them, still more ambition, still we're going to take some risks and put this out there, and we can slap our name on that, and we can say, hey, like, yeah, this probably wouldn't fly if it was any other game, and you probably wouldn't try it, but we're fucking Square, and we think you're going to like this, and there's some changes here. It just feels like they went mainstream. And they want to be mainstream. They want to desperately be mainstream, and that's why I can't get behind it, man. I mean, I'm when I say behind it, like hyped again for the third time. I think Final Fantasy 16 is going to be a good game. I think it's going to have a good plot. I think it's going to look really good. But so is Game of Thrones, and Game of Thrones is entirely corporatized, and a lot of people are saying it's the Game of Thrones of Final Fantasy. And a lot of people like Game of Thrones. I enjoyed the first 7 seasons of Game of Thrones. They were really good.
Yeah.
But even the Game of Thrones got to a point where like, this is shit, and you're just doing this because people want to play it.
Right.
You have to deliver on it. And I think that's where Final Fantasy is at right now.
I'm going to counteract by just saying I think Square has been mainstream ever since they made a Mario RPG game.
No.
Okay. Right.
So
maybe
it's
more.
Give me the sales numbers on that. I get
90s.
what you're saying, though. Yeah.
So maybe
I mean, you're not necessarily wrong.
So maybe what if I phrase it more like this? So back in the 90s and the early 2000s, Square used to be cutting edge. Square used to set the trends, and then somewhere along the way that flipped, and they kind of lost their way. Maybe it was the Spirits Within movie that derailed everything, but they kind of fell behind. And now it seemed like, I think you guys both raised interesting points. It seems like they've been chasing the trends rather than setting them. And they're desperate to get back to that point where they're setting the trends again, or to be the best at whatever the current trend is, which is probably why we saw them jump so quickly at the whole NFT thing when that was exploding. They're like, here's our chance to jump on what the current trend is going towards. And It's like you used to set these, you used to make them with hard work and cutting edge technology, and now you're right. You want to be something that you're just not anymore. Like your identity used to be the trendsetter, but you're not the trendsetter anymore. And everyone has their turn as the trendsetter, right? Sony's been the trendsetter for the last 5 years because they have quote unquote the best first party games or whatever. And now I kind of feel like public opinion is kind of turning against that now. Or maybe it's just because Sony's run by a bunch of dicks. But like Chris said, pretty much everybody that runs corporations are a giant bunch of dicks. To run a corporation, you have to be a giant dick. That's basically how it is. And video games are corporations, unless you get the rare ones like Toby Fox making Undertale, or the one guy making Stardew Valley, and he made it for 6 years and it basically killed him in his home. Somehow his relationship survived. I have no idea how that works, but yeah, that's just the reality of the world that we live in.
But dicks fuck assholes. It keeps them from shitting all over everything.
Are we still talking about video games?
Wait, what?
I think feathers
Chris, like,
go
sorry, I
in
blacked
the
out for a
ass
second.
or something.
Right.
It's 3 kinds of people: dicks, pussies, and assholes.
I've heard that joke somewhere.
I hope this is the most listened to episode of this podcast. That would make me so happy. It would make me the happiest I've ever been. But well, on that note, does anyone have anything else to add? I think we've kind of went on a 2-hour rant about Final Fantasy and Square, and this conversation took some turns that I did not expect, but I think it was still a really good, really awesome conversation. So does anyone want to have any kind of closing thoughts, or?
Fuck you, Square. It's not Final Fantasy anymore. It's going to be a good game, but it's not Final Fantasy. Fuck you.
I'll be a little optimistic and say that, yeah, if you are like Chris and you don't give a shit about Final Fantasy 16, at least you have like 20 other games you can go back to and play whenever you want, you know? So yeah, be as mad as you want, but like, just shut up and go play the one that you like. It's there. You can get it. They're making their games more available. So yeah, there's always
for
that.
more money.
Right. But that's a whole other topic conversation that we could have.
Pirating a Super Nintendo game is okay.
Yeah.
Raise those pirate flags, boys. But
just delete it after 24 hours.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Just
of total playtime.
of total play, right. No, I think I don't even remember the point I was going to make anymore. I don't even know if it matters. For me personally, I try to stay as optimistic as I can. I'm looking forward to 16. I hope that's just all sorts of crazy. And I look forward to the day that Nomura pulls off his grand scheme and fuses all of the universes together. I will be going nuts on that day. So as long as the patron saint of this podcast, Nomura, is at the helm, I will continue to be optimistic. That's all I have to say.
Or he'll whip you with his belts.
One of many, depending on what day it is.
With Lulu.
Ooh. We won't, again, treading dangerous waters there. But anyways, gentlemen.
It's very wet there.
Yes. That's just not just because Final Fantasy X takes place in a bunch of islands.
Does Lulu need a belt to hold up the belt dress?
She does not.
It's got to be a heavy dress.
I would think so. The sequel to this episode will be the history of belts in Final Fantasy games. So
the junk in that trunk is very strong.
I can't.
Anyways,
yeah, I got nothing.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. We've hit a couple of hours. I think that's a good time to stop. So thank you so much for coming on. I think this was a really awesome conversation. It exceeded all of my expectations. We laughed. Did we cry? I don't know. We got angry. We ranted. It was a good time. So if you'd like to, Chris, why don't you go ahead and go first? Shill all of the things that are happening over at Retro Hangover.
Well, yes, I am from the Retro Hangover podcast, where me and my partner Shane, we talk about a game or a person or a console or something, usually a game, very typically a game. Then we go over a brief history, talk about story, the gameplay, the graphics. Sounding too much like Secret Levels here, but we do those kind of things, and then we give it a decision whether or not it holds up today. So yeah, Retro Gaming Podcast. If you like talking about Final Fantasy like you heard here, you're going to like the Retro Hangover Podcast. And I'm just going to plug, I don't know when this episode is going to come out, but I'm going to plug it anyway. We have a series going on right now called The King of Games. We're covering the year 1992, 20 games. And both of these fine gentlemen are part of that, where we debate the games and we decide which game from 1992 is the most significant and or best of that year. So come on over. Get mad at us for making decisions you don't agree with, much like you probably did with this episode. And we hope to see you there. So that's what I got. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on here today, Eric. I had a great time.
It's always a pleasure, Chris. And yeah, if I can second that and say, definitely go check out King of Games. It's a good time. It has several interesting Shakespearean twists and turns along the way that I think you will not expect. And I won't say any more than that because I don't want to spoil it. But yeah, when this episode comes out sometime end of May, we should be right in the thick of King of Games, I believe. So yeah, look for that. That was a lot of fun. And Keith, what are you doing over in Main Quest Land?
Hi. Yeah, I'm from the Main Quest podcast. If you are a long time Unlockables listener, you've definitely heard of me before. So hi, hello. If you are coming here for the first time, I'm on other Unlockables episodes. So go check those out. But what I mostly do on my show is I go through my library of games from when I was a childhood. I replay them and see if they still hold up today. And as of this recording, so if this is at the end of May, you will basically be catching me right before I go on my break. But if I may shill out for my Patreon, there's going to be a bunch of stuff on my Patreon where I am talking about Flash games. I'll be talking about Fry Osama bin Laden. There will be an episode out.
What?
It is a Flash game called Fry.
I'm joining.
Fry Osama bin Laden.
Chris is sold.
There's also
that's been my occupation for the past 20 years.
It's a lot of fun. And then there's there's a full length side quest episode on the Star Fox franchise, and there's a specialty show called the Main Quest Matinee, where I talk about, it's me and Ryan Yingling, formerly of the Listoff podcast, and we talk about video game movies. And so there should be 2 episodes out. It's kind of like the primer episode, which is actually on the main feed as well. And the first movie we'll be covering is 2002's Resident Evil. So you can go check all that stuff out on the Patreon, and there'll be stuff coming out on that throughout the summer while I take a break from the main feed. Don't ask me the URL, I completely forgot, but it'll be in the Linktree, which is linktr.ee/mainquestpod.
There you go. Definitely go check it out. All that stuff is going to be absolutely fantastic. And hi, my name is Eric. You've found this show, so thank you very much for listening. If this is your first episode, wow, what a first episode for you to jump into. Absolutely spectacular. But you can find all of my stuff also at linktr.ee/unlockables. If you want to go check out some extra stuff, I too have a Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/unlockables, and a couple tiers. There's a couple goodies there. I do some mini monologues about stuff I don't normally get to talk about on the show. I do mini game reviews. I have a Pokemon anime rewatch series where I'm going to rewatch all 1,000+ episodes of the Pokemon anime and just kind of make jokes about them, I guess. And then I have some bonus VIP episodes on there, top 10 lists, all that good stuff. So I don't know how much stuff is on there currently, but if you subscribe, you'll get some extra goodies if you like listening to me. So go check that out. And yeah, gentlemen, again, thank you guys so much. This is always a pleasure getting to talk to you guys. I've looked up to you guys ever since I started podcasting. So this was an awesome, awesome conversation and definitely lived up to the hype. So thank you guys once again.
Thanks for having me back.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anytime. You guys both have a standing invitation. So if you ever want to come on and yell about shit, I'm down for it. Anyways, that being said, I want to wish everybody a good night. And as always, remember, it's not just the story of video games, it is the story of you.